The cathedral bells had barely finished their wedding chime when Lady Margaret Ashworth collapsed at the altar, her ivory silk gown pooling around her like spilled milk on ancient stone. The groom, Lord Edmund Blackthorne, stood frozen as his bride's face drained of all color, her eyes rolling back in terror before she crumpled to the floor. What should have been the happiest moment of their lives had become a nightmare that would haunt the halls of Ravenshollow Manor for generations. But this wasn't a simple case of wedding day nerves or a too-tight corset. What Margaret had seen in those final moments before her vows would shatter everything she believed about the man she was about to marry. Hidden beneath the polished veneer of aristocratic charm lay secrets so dark, so twisted, that even the bravest souls would flee in horror. Welcome back to Scandalous Pasts, where we uncover the most shocking secrets hidden behind history's most elegant facades. Today, we're diving into a tale of deception, betrayal, and terror that unfolded in the shadowy corridors of English high society. Before we begin this chilling journey, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our explorations into history's darkest corners. The year was 1847, and the marriage between the Ashworth and Blackthorne families was meant to be the social event of the season. Two of England's most prestigious bloodlines uniting in holy matrimony, cementing alliances that stretched back centuries. The bride was beautiful, the groom handsome and wealthy, and their union promised to be the stuff of fairy tales. But fairy tales, as we know, often hide the most sinister truths. Chapter 1, The Perfect Gentleman. Lord Edmund Blackthorne cut an impressive figure in Victorian society. At 32, he possessed the kind of dark, brooding handsomeness that made ladies' hearts flutter behind their fans. His estate, Ravenshollow Manor, sprawled across thousands of acres in the Yorkshire moors, its Gothic towers piercing the perpetually grey sky like accusing fingers. Edmund had inherited the title and fortune at the tender age of 21 when his father died under mysterious circumstances. Some whispered of a hunting accident, others of a weak heart, but the official records remained sealed. What mattered to society was that young Edmund had transformed from a reckless youth into a model gentleman seemingly overnight. He was charming at dinner parties, generous with his charitable donations, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of art and literature that impressed even the most learned scholars. Ladies swooned when he entered a room, and gentlemen sought his counsel on matters of business and politics. Edmund Blackthorne was, by all appearances, the perfect catch. Lady Margaret Ashworth first encountered Edmund at a Christmas ball in 1846. She was 19, with golden hair that caught candlelight like spun silk and eyes the color of summer sky. The daughter of Earl Ashworth, she had been raised in luxury and educated by the finest tutors money could buy. Margaret was intelligent, spirited, and possessed a natural curiosity that sometimes worried her more conservative relatives. When Edmund asked her to dance that December evening, Margaret felt as though she was floating on air. He was attentive without being overwhelming, witty without being cruel, and when he spoke of his travels across Europe, his eyes held depths that promised adventure and mystery. Their courtship followed all the proper protocols. Edmund called upon Margaret at precisely the right intervals, always accompanied by appropriate chaperones. He brought her books of poetry, rare flowers from his greenhouse, and once, a delicate music box that played a haunting melody he claimed to have heard in a Venetian palazzo. Margaret's parents were delighted with the match. The Blackthorne fortune would secure their daughter's future, while the Ashworth connections would elevate Edmund standing in political circles. It was a union blessed by both love and logic, or so it seemed. But Margaret, with her keen intellect and observant nature, began to notice small inconsistencies in Edmund's stories. Places he claimed to have visited but described incorrectly. Books he supposedly loved but couldn't quote accurately. And sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, she caught glimpses of something cold and calculating behind his warm brown eyes. Chapter 2, Shadows in the Manor. As their wedding day approached, Margaret was invited to spend a week at Ravenshollow Manor to oversee the final preparations. The estate was magnificent but unsettling, with its labyrinthine corridors and rooms that seemed to swallow light. The servants moved like ghosts, speaking in whispers and avoiding direct eye contact. Mrs. Hartwell, the elderly housekeeper, had served the Blackthorne family for over 40 years. She was a stern woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to hold decades of secrets. When Margaret tried to engage her in conversation about the manor's history, Mrs. Hartwell's responses were clipped and evasive. "The family has always valued privacy, my lady," she would say, her voice carrying a warning that Margaret couldn't quite decipher. The manor itself seemed to whisper with hidden stories. Portraits of previous Blackthorne lords lined the walls, their painted eyes following visitors with unsettling intensity. Margaret noticed that several frames hung slightly askew, as if someone had recently removed and hastily replaced them. Edmund's study was off-limits, he explained, due to important business documents that required absolute confidentiality. The East Wing was closed for renovations that never seemed to progress. And the cellars, he claimed, were unsafe due to structural concerns that had persisted for generations. But it was the nights that truly unsettled Margaret. Strange sounds echoed through the corridors after midnight, footsteps that shouldn't exist, doors creaking open and closed, and sometimes, what sounded almost like muffled sobbing. When she mentioned these disturbances to Edmund, he dismissed them as old house settling or perhaps mice in the walls. "Raven's Hollow has stood for 3 centuries, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Old buildings develop their own personalities, my dear." Margaret's unease grew when she discovered a locked door hidden behind a tapestry in what was to become her private sitting room. When she asked Edmund about it, his face darkened for just a moment before the charming mask slipped back into place. "Storage," he said curtly. "Nothing that would interest a lady." But Margaret's curiosity was now fully aroused. That night, she waited until the manor fell silent before slipping from her room with a candle and a hairpin she had bent into a makeshift lock-pick, a skill learned from a mischievous cousin during childhood summers. Chapter 3, The Discovery. The hidden door opened with surprising ease, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. Margaret's candle flame flickered in the stale air as she carefully made her way down the stone steps. The passage was older than the rest of the manor, carved from living rock and worn smooth by centuries of use. At the bottom, she found herself in a circular chamber that predated the Gothic manor above. Ancient symbols were carved into the walls, and niches held objects that made her blood run cold. Bones arranged in ritualistic patterns. Candles burned down to twisted stumps. And books, dozens of leather-bound volumes written in languages she couldn't identify. But it was the portraits that stopped her heart. Not paintings, but photographs, a relatively new invention that captured reality with brutal honesty. They showed women, all young and beautiful, all wearing wedding gowns. And all bearing expressions of absolute terror. Margaret's hands shook as she examined the images more closely. Some of the women looked familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have seen them. Others were complete strangers, but their fear was universal and heartbreaking. At the center of the chamber stood an altar of black stone, its surface stained with substances Margaret didn't want to identify. Shackles hung from the walls, and the floor was marked with symbols that seemed to writhe in the candlelight. As she turned to flee, Margaret's foot struck something metallic. Looking down, she saw a collection of wedding rings, each engraved with different initials but all bearing the same date, the anniversary of some unholy ritual that had been repeated year after year. The truth crashed over her like a physical blow. Edmund Blackthorne wasn't just a wealthy lord seeking a suitable wife. He was something far more sinister, a predator who had been hunting for decades, using his charm and position to lure innocent women into his web. Margaret stumbled back up the stairs, her mind reeling with the implications. How many brides had stood where she now stood? How many had discovered the truth too late? And what had become of them all? Chapter 4, The Wedding Day Horror. Margaret spent the remaining days before her wedding in a state of barely controlled panic. She considered fleeing, but where could she go? Edmund's influence extended far beyond Yorkshire, and her own family would never believe such fantastic accusations without proof. She thought about confronting him directly, but the memory of those photographs, the terror in those young women's eyes, convinced her that Edmund was far more dangerous than his genteel facade suggested. If she revealed what she knew, she might not live to see another sunrise. Instead, Margaret decided to play along until she could find a way to expose Edmund's crimes and escape his clutches. She would gather evidence, document everything she had seen, and find a way to alert the authorities. But first, she had to survive her own wedding. The morning of the ceremony dawned grey and forbidding, with storm clouds gathering over the Yorkshire moors like an omen of doom. Margaret dressed mechanically, her maid chattering excitedly about the beautiful gown and the handsome groom while Margaret's mind raced with plans for survival. The cathedral was packed with the cream of English society, all eager to witness the union of two great families. Margaret walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her smile frozen in place as she approached the altar where Edmund waited. He looked magnificent in his formal attire, every inch the perfect gentleman. But when Margaret looked into his eyes, she saw something that chilled her to the bone. He knew. Somehow, Edmund knew that she had discovered his secret. As the ceremony began, Margaret felt as though she was watching herself from a great distance. The priest's words seemed to echo from another world, and the faces of the congregation blurred into a sea of meaningless smiles. It was when the priest asked if anyone objected to the union that Margaret's composure finally cracked. In that moment of traditional silence, she heard something that made her blood freeze, the sound of chains rattling beneath the cathedral floor. Chapter 5, The Revelation. The sound was subtle, almost imperceptible beneath the rustle of silk gowns and the shuffling of feet. But Margaret heard it clearly, and in that instant, she understood the full scope of Edmund's depravity. The cathedral itself was part of his hunting ground. The ancient crypts beneath the church had been converted into chambers of horror, and somewhere below their feet, his previous victims were still alive, still suffering, still waiting for death to release them from their torment. Margaret's vision began to tunnel as the horrible truth overwhelmed her. This wasn't just about murder, it was about prolonged torture, about keeping his brides alive to feed whatever twisted desires drove him. The photographs she had seen weren't death portraits but documentation of ongoing suffering. As Edmund reached for her hand to place the ring, Margaret saw something that confirmed her worst fears. His fingers were stained with what looked like dried blood, hastily scrubbed but not completely clean. He had been below the cathedral that very morning, tending to his collection of living dolls. The weight of absolute horror crashed down upon Margaret like a physical force. Her knees buckled, her vision went black, and she collapsed at the altar in a dead faint, her wedding gown spreading around her like the wings of a fallen angel. Chapter 6, The Aftermath. When Margaret regained consciousness, she found herself in a carriage racing through the countryside. Edmund sat across from her, his mask of gentility finally dropped to reveal the predator beneath. "You saw the chamber," he said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "I had hoped you would be more accepting of your new role." Margaret's voice came out as barely a whisper. "The women in the photographs. My previous wives," Edmund confirmed with a smile that belonged in nightmares. "Each one thought she was special, just as you did. Each one discovered the truth eventually. And each one learned to appreciate the honor I bestowed upon them." The carriage was heading away from civilization, toward the remote reaches of the moors where screams would never be heard. Margaret realized that her fainting spell had actually saved her life. By collapsing in front of hundreds of witnesses, she had forced Edmund to abandon whatever immediate plans he had for her. But now they were alone, and she could see in his eyes that her temporary reprieve was over. "You see, my dear Margaret," Edmund continued, his voice taking on the tone of a professor lecturing a particularly slow student, "marriage is about possession. Complete and total possession. My wives belong to me in ways that conventional society could never understand." Margaret's mind raced, searching for any possible escape. The carriage was moving too fast for her to jump safely, and Edmund was positioned between her and the door. But she had one advantage: he still believed she was the helpless, fainting bride rather than the intelligent woman who had already uncovered his secrets. Chapter 7, The Escape. As the carriage rounded a bend in the moorland road, Margaret saw her chance. A steep ravine ran alongside the path, and beyond it lay a dense forest where she might be able to hide. It was a desperate gamble, but staying in the carriage meant certain doom. "Edmund," she said, forcing her voice to sound weak and confused, "I don't understand what's happening. Please, take me home to my parents." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Oh, my sweet, naive little bride. You are home. You're exactly where you belong." In that moment, as Edmund's attention focused on her face, Margaret struck. She had pawned a hatpin during her supposed unconsciousness, and now she drove it deep into his thigh, causing him to roar in pain and surprise. As he doubled over, Margaret threw herself against the carriage door, tumbling out onto the rocky ground. Pain shot through her body as she rolled down the embankment, her wedding dress tearing on thorns and stones. Behind her, she could hear Edmund shouting orders to the driver, his cultured voice now raw with rage. But Margaret was already on her feet, running toward the forest with the desperation of a woman who knew that capture meant a fate worse than death. Chapter 8. The hunt. The Yorkshire moors were unforgiving terrain, especially for a woman in a torn wedding gown and delicate slippers. But Margaret had spent her childhood exploring the countryside around her family's estate, and she knew how to move quietly through dense undergrowth. Edmund's voice echoed across the moors as he organized his pursuit. Margaret realized with growing horror that he wasn't alone. The carriage driver and at least 2 other men were helping him hunt her down. How many people were part of his conspiracy? How long had this been going on? As night fell, Margaret found temporary shelter in a shepherd's abandoned hut. Her feet were bleeding, her dress was in tatters, and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. But she couldn't rest for long. She could hear her pursuers calling to each other in the darkness, their voices growing closer. In the distance, she could see lights from what appeared to be a small village. If she could reach civilization, she might be able to find help. But between her and safety lay miles of treacherous moorland and the men who wanted to drag her back to Edmund's chamber of horrors. Margaret forced herself to keep moving, using the stars to navigate toward the distant lights. Every shadow might hide an enemy, every sound might herald her capture. But the memory of those photographs, those terrified faces of women who had trusted Edmund just as she had, gave her the strength to continue. Chapter 9. The revelation spreads. What Margaret didn't know was that her dramatic collapse at the altar had set other wheels in motion. Several guests had noticed Edmund's strange reaction to his bride's fainting spell. Instead of showing concern, he had seemed angry, almost frustrated. Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, had watched the ceremony from the servants' section of the cathedral. When she saw Margaret collapse, something in the old woman's conscience finally broke. She had kept Edmund's secrets for decades, but seeing another young woman about to suffer the same fate as all the others was more than she could bear. After the wedding party dispersed in confusion, Mrs. Hartwell approached Margaret's father, Earl Ashworth. In halting, frightened words, she told him about the chamber beneath the manor, about the sounds that came from the east wing at night, and about the previous wives who had simply vanished after their wedding days. Earl Ashworth was initially skeptical, but Mrs. Hartwell's obvious terror convinced him to investigate. Along with several other concerned guests, including a retired magistrate and a colonel from the local regiment, they made their way to Raven's Hollow Manor. What they found in the hidden chamber exceeded their worst nightmares. Chapter 10. The underground horror. The photographs were damning enough, but they were nothing compared to what lay deeper in the tunnels beneath the manor. Following passages that seemed to stretch for miles underground, the rescue party discovered a network of cells that had been carved from the living rock. In these chambers, they found Edmund's collection, women in various stages of physical and mental deterioration, some who had been imprisoned for years. The magistrate later wrote that the scene was beyond the scope of human comprehension, a vision of hell brought to earth by a madman's twisted desires. Some of the women were beyond saving, their minds shattered by years of torment. Others, more recent captives, were able to tell their stories of how they had been lured to Raven's Hollow by Edmund's charm, only to discover the truth too late. The rescue party also found detailed journals in Edmund's handwriting, documenting his crimes with the clinical precision of a scientist studying specimens. He had been perfecting his methods for over a decade, learning how to keep his victims alive and compliant through a combination of drugs, psychological manipulation, and carefully calibrated physical abuse. But Edmund himself was nowhere to be found. The carriage had returned to the manor without him, and the driver claimed ignorance of his master's whereabouts. The hunt for both Edmund and Margaret was now a race against time. Chapter 11. The final confrontation. Margaret had been running for 2 days when exhaustion finally overcame her. She collapsed beside a stream, her body unable to take another step. As she lay there, listening to the water babble over stones, she heard the sound she had been dreading, hoofbeats approaching through the forest. Edmund emerged from the trees on horseback, his clothes torn and his face bearing scratches from thorns. But his eyes still held that terrible, predatory gleam. "Did you really think you could escape me, my dear?" he asked, dismounting with casual grace. "I know these moors better than anyone. I've hunted here for years." Margaret struggled to her feet, backing toward the stream. "They'll find your chamber," she gasped. "People will know what you've done." Edmund's laugh was like breaking glass. "My chamber? Oh, my sweet, naive Margaret. That was just the beginning. Do you think I would keep all my treasures in one place?" The implication hit Margaret like a physical blow. There were other locations, other chambers, other women suffering in darkness while Edmund played the role of a gentleman. The scope of his crimes was beyond anything she had imagined. "You see," Edmund continued, advancing slowly like a cat stalking wounded prey, "I am not just a collector of beautiful things. I am an artist, and my art requires living canvas. You were going to be my masterpiece." Margaret's hand closed around a stone from the stream bed. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all she had. "I'll die before I let you touch me again." "Oh, my dear," Edmund smiled, "death is not an option I offer. Life, on the other hand, life can be stretched and shaped in the most remarkable ways." Chapter 12. Justice in the Moors. As Edmund lunged forward, Margaret threw the stone with all her remaining strength. It struck him in the temple, causing him to stumble and fall to one knee. But he was far from defeated, and Margaret knew she had only moments before he recovered. That's when the sound of approaching horses filled the air. Earl Ashworth, the magistrate, and a squad of constables burst through the trees, their faces grim with purpose. They had been following Edmund's trail for hours, guided by Mrs. Hartwell's knowledge of his favorite hunting grounds. Edmund's transformation was instantaneous. The predator vanished, replaced by the charming gentleman who had fooled society for so long. "Thank God you found us," he exclaimed, helping Margaret to her feet with apparent concern. "My poor bride has been wandering in delirium since her collapse. I've been searching for her everywhere." But the magistrate had seen the evidence in the chamber. He had read Edmund's journals and heard the testimony of the survivors. "Lord Edmund Blackthorne," he said formally, "you are under arrest for the crimes of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and murder." Edmund's mask slipped one final time, revealing the monster beneath. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," he snarled. "My work is beyond your comprehension. I am creating something beautiful, something eternal." "The only thing eternal," Earl Ashworth replied, "will be your imprisonment." Epilogue. The reckoning. Edmund Blackthorne's trial became the sensation of the decade. The evidence against him was overwhelming: the Chamber of Horrors, the detailed journals, the testimony of survivors, and the photographs that documented his crimes in brutal detail. But even as he stood in the dock, Edmund maintained his composure, speaking of his art and his collection as if they were legitimate pursuits. The judge, clearly disturbed by the defendant's complete lack of remorse, sentenced him to death by hanging. Margaret testified at the trial, her voice steady despite the trauma she had endured. Her courage in escaping and her willingness to face her tormentor in court inspired other victims to come forward, revealing the true scope of Edmund's crimes. The investigation uncovered 3 more hidden chambers in remote locations across Yorkshire, each containing evidence of Edmund's decade-long reign of terror. In total, authorities estimated that he had kidnapped and tortured over 30 women, with only a handful surviving to tell their stories. Raven's Hollow Manor was demolished by order of the court, its stones scattered and its foundations filled with concrete. The site was consecrated and turned into a memorial garden for Edmund's victims, a place of peace where flowers bloomed where horror had once reigned. Margaret never married. The trauma of her experience had left her unable to trust in the same way again. But she dedicated her life to helping other women who had suffered similar ordeals, establishing shelters and support networks that would continue her work long after she was gone. Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper who had finally found the courage to speak out, lived out her remaining years in a cottage provided by Earl Ashworth. She often said that helping to stop Edmund was the only good thing she had ever done, though many argued that her courage had saved countless future victims. Edmund Blackthorne was executed on a grey morning in 1848, maintaining his composure to the end. His final words, according to witnesses, were, "My art will live forever." But he was wrong. His legacy was not one of artistic achievement but of the courage shown by those who survived him and the justice that finally caught up with his crimes. The case changed how society viewed the aristocracy, revealing that titles and wealth could hide the darkest of secrets. It also led to reforms in how missing persons cases were investigated, particularly when they involved young women from wealthy families. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret's story became a symbol of survival and resistance. Her refusal to become another victim, her courage in the face of unimaginable horror, and her determination to see justice done inspired generations of women to speak out against their abusers. The cathedral where Margaret collapsed still stands today, though the crypts beneath have been sealed forever. Visitors sometimes report feeling a chill in the air near the altar, as if the stones themselves remember that moment when a young bride's world shattered and her fight for survival began. In the end, Edmund Blackthorne's greatest failure was underestimating the woman he chose as his final victim. He saw Margaret as just another beautiful object to add to his collection, but she proved to be something far more dangerous to his plans, a survivor with the intelligence and courage to bring his reign of terror to an end. So there you have it, the chilling tale of the groom who watched his bride faint in horror, not knowing that her collapse would be the beginning of his downfall. Which part of this story shocked you the most? The hidden chamber beneath the manor? Edmund's collection of living victims? Or Margaret's incredible escape through the Yorkshire moors? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if this story kept you on the edge of your seat. Make sure to subscribe to Scandalous Pasts and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's most shocking secrets. Remember, the stories we tell here at Scandalous Pasts are fictional tales that may or may not be inspired by real events. While the emotions and human experiences we explore are very real, these particular narratives come from the realm of imagination. Until next time, keep questioning the facades that history presents to us, because sometimes the most polished surfaces hide the darkest truths.